We've heard from Claire about some of the technical considerations, but running an online training session requires some careful design as well. And some of these criteria are applicable to any tutorial, and I'm sure you're all used to designing for face-to-face tutorials. However, there are some areas of teaching online which are a bit more challenging, and it's even more important when teaching online to stay focused on whatever it is you're trying to teach. Next slide. You probably won't be able to see this very well, but this is just a reminder that we have delivered workshops on effective and engaging online teaching at several conferences in the last year. And this is the template we use, and it covers a few of the things that we're talking about here in this session. And it even has space for you to fill in your own sessions. So, and it's available from a link on the last slide. Next slide. So one of the first things we do is we have a clear objective, a one-sentence objective, which helps us to start focusing on how we're going to run the tutorial. Next slide. And all of our sessions have learning outcomes. In this case, we've called it aims of this event rather than learning outcomes because it's not exactly a teaching session. 3 is a good number, so don't have too many. And one of the things about having the learning outcomes at the beginning and also at the end means that the students can gauge how much of the aims of the session they've actually absorbed by the end of it. So we often have we have covered and the list of learning outcomes again at the end of the session. In order to keep the session focused and students engaged, don't have too many. 3 is a good number. I wouldn't have more than 5. And keep referring to them as you design your session so you stay on track. Librarians love to tell people things, but do students really want to know everything? And I suppose the answer is no, they don't actually. So these are just ours for this session. Next slide. And again, I'm sure you're all very familiar with delivering content in face-to-face sessions. You're always thinking about the level of your students, what kind of content these students need at that particular point. Keep to your objectives and outcomes. It's fatally easy to try and teach them more than they really want to know. And this is why it's good to keep going back to your learning outcomes and objectives so you remain focused. One of the problems we have as librarians is that very often we only get one shot, don't we? The students come along and we teach them for one session. So it's fatally easy to try and cram everything that they could possibly want to know for 3 years into one session. And that really doesn't work either for you or the students. So you think of going online as being an opportunity, because it's much easier in an online environment to put some library learning content or a library training session into a particular module. So think of it as a possibility rather than a problem. And the way we run our sessions, we have a lot of generic sessions which can be slotted into a module if necessary, and we also do a lot of targeted sessions which are particularly for that particular module and which are aimed at perhaps some students doing a particular assignment. Another thing online is vary the way you present your content. So if the tool allows, use audio or visual content, use whiteboards. You can share your screen live in these tools so you can actually demonstrate things. And another reason for varying the content, of course, is that nobody wants to spend 20 minutes staring at the same slide. You might be able to get away with that in a face-to-face situation where you know, you're the focus of attention, but it really doesn't work online. Next slide. For me, this and the next slide are the most important parts of teaching online. Creating social presence is much more difficult online than it is in a classroom. So you need to create a rapport with your students, and it's particularly hard for librarians because, as I say, we don't very often get to see the students, and we don't tend to see them over a long period of time as their tutors do. So when you're delivering a library training session online, you really need to get your social presence right. So introduce yourself, maybe have a webcam, maybe a photo. And then we also use low stakes polls at the beginning of a training session, just to start a discussion and to get a feeling of general chat with the students. So we do things like we ask what the weather's like where you are, or how are you finding your course, or have you used the online library before? And this gets the students talking to each other as well as to you. Normally we find that students aren't very keen on using their microphones. They're much happier using the chat, but that's just the way the students are. So the key thing is that you're trying to create a friendly atmosphere, and you want to come over as a knowledgeable and interested person that they can ask questions of. And again, that's something that you would normally do in a face-to-face situation quite easily, but as I say, in an online situation, something like a poll, a low stakes poll, not too difficult, really helps to get the conversation going. And a bit of humour doesn't come amiss either, because very often the technology wobbles, and students can be quite forgiving about this, because obviously the same thing happens to them as well. So don't let it get to you, just bounce back. Next slide, please. I think for me, this is the key thing in online teaching, is interactivity. It needs to be built into a session, but obviously, of course, you also need to be mindful of the time. And in some ways, it's easier to get students to do things online as they're already connected. You can show them how to do things, sharing your screen. You can get them to try it themselves and report back. You can use polls to gauge understanding, smiley faces, green ticks. And this also helps creating a bit of a pause, so you can let people catch up, which is one of the things about teaching online, is that it's quite hard to concentrate, and there's a lot going on. And a little bit of a pause every now and then is really helpful. So in this session, when we get to the top tips slide, we pause for questions, and that's the way we've built it into this particular session. You can also use whiteboards to suggest, for example, keywords, or you can move things around on a whiteboard to create a statement or a reference, for example. So use whatever tools the software you're using allows, and it's good to have a really good deep look into what your particular tool can actually do in the way of interactivity, because I think this is probably one of the key things in delivering online training. Next slide. Next slide. Oh, right, feedback from students. Yes, you can usually get instant feedback while you're actually delivering the session if you've got polls. So that's a really handy way. So, for example, you can say, have you used the online library before? Yes, no, maybe, not sure. So short polls at the beginning are a good way of gauging the experience of the room, and then later on in the session you can also use them to gauge whether they've actually understood, and you can usually find out from the chat as well whether students are really following what you're saying. We actually have a short survey link to JISC online surveys at the end of all our sessions. And we encourage students to fill it in, and as an incentive, we have a draw once a month where students are entered, who have filled in the feedback, are entered into a draw, and the lucky winner gets an Amazon voucher. So that's just one Amazon voucher a month, so you know, we can more or less afford that. We also have a student panel who can be surveyed, and it's really helpful to us to have all this data from the student survey forms. Not all of them fill it in, of course, but the ones we do get quite a few filling them in. And it gives us a really rich source of data to help with the design of our sessions. It's also very helpful to individual librarians who've delivered the session to look at the feedback and see how it went, and think about what went well and whether there's other things they can do to make the next session even better. And of course, another thing you can get from having an online survey at the end of the session, as we do, it can really show the value of the tutorials to faculty if you get good feedback. Next slide. So I've just got a few slides now to show you some examples of interactivity in some of our sessions. So in this particular one, we teach our students a framework, who, why, when, to evaluate resources, and then we give them a link to an article about homeopathy. We send them off for 3 minutes to have a look at it, and then when they come back, they vote in the poll to say, is this article reliable or not? Next slide. This is an example from using library search for your assignment. We've got a number of topics on a whiteboard slide, and we get the students to write on it, you know, squiggles, round, circles, whatever. So that, and then the librarian will choose the one with the most squiggles or lines or whatever to actually do the searching. I'm afraid this sometimes leads to a bit of cheating with people underlining more than once. This is more fun doing this than just running a prepared topic, because the students are a bit more invested in the topic, and it's just a fun way of choosing a topic to search, and it's a bit more interactive. This kind of thing can cause problems with bandwidth, so we generally don't do this if there are more than, say, 50 students in the room. Next slide. In this one, again, we get the students to circle the process words and underline the content words in an essay writing tutorial, which we're running here. And we've previously explained to them what process words are in an essay, and then we get them to tell us which one is the process words and which are the content words they will need to research for the assignment. Next slide. And finally, this is from a level 1 science module where we send give the students a link to an article by a BBC reporter, and then we ask the students to find out who the reporter is and do they think that she has the credentials to write this particular article, why did she write it, and when was it written. So it's the www one again. So that's just some brief examples of some of the interactivity in some of our sessions. We also do demonstrating databases and get them to go and do the same thing, that kind of thing as well. Next slide. Right, so these are my top tips, and I'll just ask Wendy if there are any particular questions that we can answer at this point.
Hi, there's a few questions, Fiona. I think some of them you answered during your session or during your delivery. And one was about how do you end a session? And I think the answer is we summarise, we revisit the objectives and give opportunity for additional questions. And that's at the point where you request feedback.
I think you've answered my question for me, Wendy.
Okay. Also, a question about what we think about having the presenter in a window, having the presenter visible in a video. And I think what we've decided that is because of the bandwidth issues that it's sometimes useful to have the presenter on video at the beginning, but then cut away from that. Would you agree?
Yes, I would. In fact, I was running a session for level 1 engineering students last night, and I just had a small picture of myself available all the time while I was speaking, just to one side of the slides. So that's another way of doing it. If you're worried about bandwidth, you can just have a small picture of yourself.
I read a few questions about the length of the sessions and also about why you would go for live rather than synchronous. And So we might want to say a little bit about the mixture of what we offer.
Yes, certainly. We record all our sessions, and the generic ones, we choose the best one and we put it up on YouTube with subtitles, which Hossam will tell you more about later. The targeted sessions are actually run on the module website, so they're only available to students from that particular module. And again, we'll record it and make that available. Normally what happens with the length of the sessions is the generic ones tend to be 30 to 45 minutes long. Our students told us that they didn't want long sessions, so we made sure that we had a number of sessions, a suite of sessions, which are just shorter than 1 hour. And so a student can, for example, do using library search your assignment, and then if they're interested, they can go on to do smarter searching with databases, which assumes that you already know how to use library search. So we do it that way. We have a suite of generic sessions. The targeted sessions tend to be 1 hour in length because you have a bit more time with the students and they are focused on doing an assignment.
But also, if I could add, we do offer to students and to modules short activities which are written or might be screencasts, and they're also available either through the library website or through modules. But offering the live sessions, it may often duplicate the same material, but it's just a different way of learning for the students, and it does give them the opportunity to ask questions, which I think is one of the key points of having the live sessions.